Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, I'm going to be going over the Liverpool Regional Championships, which occurred over the weekend. It was a 1,518 player tournament, which is insane for a European regional. The EUIC last year was essentially the same number of participants, so it shows that the game is growing not only in the US, but also over here in Europe, which is phenomenal to see. We have a really interesting, diverse top 8 with some pretty interesting tech inclusions, as well as list adaptations for even some of the known archetypes out there, so definitely going to be good to get into some of these in detail. But let's kick things off with the day 1 and 2 breakdown. This is the day 1 field, and Charizard retains its spot as the most popular archetype in the game at 17%. And then Miraidon and Giratina are still vying for contention in that top 3. Tina at 12%, even though it's won the last few regional championships, still isn't really going above that threshold. And I think this is mostly because of its difficulty to play, as well as possibly some fear that archetypes are going to shift around this now that it is sort of respected as one of the top dogs. Roaring Moon is keeping up in play with that 9%. It had a pretty good time in Charlotte. We see Lost Zone Box actually creep its way onto the graphic. It hasn't been in many of the day 1 fields for the US, but we have seen a decent amount of Sablezard and a couple of Roaring Moon plus Iron Hands based builds. Some high profile players like Tord from Europe obviously has popularized some of the Lost Mash pile type things, which is pretty interesting to see, and Mew just about squeaks onto the day 1 graphic with that 8% as well. Interesting to see that Gardevoir has really fallen off in popularity, but as we get to the day 2, it's actually one of the big winners. Charizard retains at 17%, Giratina once again converting well from day 1 to day 2, but Gardevoir jumps all the way up to that 3rd place, pushing Miraidon all the way off the graphic as well. So Gardevoir really profiting from that day 1 field, which is quite surprising to me for how popular Miraidon actually was at that 12%. But at least Gardevoir did gain that sort of good matchup of Roaring Moon in the process. Mew VMAX, again, having always impressive conversions, and Roaring Moon and Lost Box basically retain their conversion rate as well. So outside of Miraidon, all the other top contenders continue to do well going into the second day of the tournament. And we can see another nice breakdown with the pie charts from Complexity Card Gaming, just giving us another representation, a more full picture here. Interesting that Miraidon was also at 11, which is the same as the Lost Zone boxes. So even though Miraidon did fall, it didn't actually have a catastrophic day 1 to day 2. Snorlax doing pretty okay. Some Arceus variants in there, which we will take a look at in the top 32 as well, which are quite interesting. Handful of Rapid Strike, and also the other decks were like a couple of Regidrago, Goldengos, some Chempao, some Entei Valiant, stuff like that also made it in 1s and 2s. So getting into the deck list then, and it was actually Fabrizio from Peru making the trip over from Latin America to play in a European tournament. Again, LATAM are really starved for tournaments right now, so they are forced essentially to travel if they want to achieve their Worlds invites. And for Fabrizio, the job is done. You've won a regional championship, so huge congratulations for that. Fabrizio is a pretty experienced Mew player. I know a decent number of international championships and regional championship finishes with Mew in the past, so it's no surprise to see that they had a pretty good run. One of the most insane things is their poker stats showing that they had one of the most difficult days for a Mew player possible. They went 4-0 against Roaring Moon, and they went 3-1 against Charizard EX, which is a testament to Fabrizio as a fantastic pilot of the archetype, but also the fact that Mew really is that cockroach archetype that has win conditions into pretty much everything in the format. This looks very similar to Ian Robb's 60 that we saw as of late, but it has incorporated a Lost City back into the deck list, because in recent weeks we have seen Drapion as well as Spiritomb popping up here and there, so having that Lost Zone option is a great thing to have in the deck once again. Brent Tonneson is another player on tour right now, really enjoying the buff in prizing this year, this time going with Giratina V-Star. Tina once again making the finals. It's proving itself to be just such a ruthless performer. Interestingly enough, Brent is playing kind of a greedy list, to be honest with you, not playing any Manaphy, not playing Spiritomb, and did end up losing to Fabrizio in Swiss and in the finals, but also choosing not to play any copies of Pokegear, which in the most recent weeks, the most successful builds have been playing 2 copies to just give yourself higher odds of getting into those chorus in the opening stages and giving yourself better pushes towards boss and rock sound when required. Instead, Brent has gone for just higher copies of the power card, like a 2nd copy of Catcher, a 4th copy of Path to the Peak, and also going back up to 2 copies of Sableye. As someone who fell victim to bricking a lot in Liverpool with a Lost Zone engine, I really want to see these gears come back into the deck list. But what can you say? It's another great result for Brent. We go into top 4 then with Brennan Kammerman, who has been having a phenomenal run with Sablezard in the last few tournaments, including the LAIC, where it all began. plan for this set, and constantly Brennan has been playing Roaring Moon plus Mirage Gates in a 4-count alongside the Radiant Charizard. The Roaring Moon is not just going to be that sort of Mew VMAX tech, but also just has that gouging option in a ton of matchups to have that high damage output presence. And playing such heavy Mirage Gate gives you answers earlier on in the game with that Radzard, so that you can use it over and over again into multi-prize matchups, knowing that you have Clara for those reloads as the game develops and the opponent has taken more prize cards. The Tempting Trap Mawile has made its way back into some deck lists of Lost Zone. Just one copy is a little bit risky, but the most recent Azul builds of Charizard EX had been cutting Lost Cities, so I think you can get away with that with the Rods and the Claras to reload the Tempting Trap in the Charizard matchups. Knowing that typically Charizard plays one copy of Switch and Gardevoir typically plays 1 or 0 Professor Churro, the Mawile gives you this alternate line during the game to capitalize on your opponent's counts. Every now and then we see the Mawile kind of cat out the bag moment, and it seemed like Liverpool was just another one of those tournaments where it was a great choice. It's genuinely difficult for Gardevoir and Charizard to commit enough spaces to actually have the correct answers to this Mawile, so I do think it will continue to be a good deck going forward. Once again, I'm not bitter. I bricked a ton in Liverpool with a Lost Zone engine, and once again, seeing no gear in this deck list does make me cringe a little bit, especially because you don't have the backup draw power of Radiant Greninja, so that would be something that I try and work in as a 1 or 2 count in this list. Snorlax has found its way back into top 4 as well, another great placement for the archetype. Niklaus was able to avoid Giratina for the most part. They lost to Brent in Swiss and then once again in Top Cut, so it seems like every now and then Snorlax will have the right matchups and just go deep into the tournament. Niklaus, however, was playing a really interesting deck list which was incorporating much more item cards than traditional Snorlax builds and using Pokestop to give yourself extra dig potential. This list is completely sacking off the Giratina matchup, which is admittedly quite negative, with the bonus of essentially just having more draw power in other matchups. The Cross Receiver being a really interesting item card where you can play 2 at once to get a supporter back from the discard pile. This is a really versatile option and can allow the deck to be quite reactive to what the opponent's doing and get an instant response supporter for the situation. And take no notice of the Egg Incubator. I think this was entirely a meme inclusion into the deck list, so congrats for getting Egg Incubator on Limitless. There were 2 Charizard Pidgeots that made the top 8. Lawrence Van Breck played double Technical Machine Devolution, which is certainly a good tech card for the mirror. Lawrence went 3-0 in the mirror in the Swiss rounds, so seemed to be a pretty decent choice. Kaito Arai is a really dangerous Japanese player who has done well at a number of international championships and has once again shown up to a big European tournament and had a great placement. Despite playing 0 TM Devo or Justified Gloves, they were still able to overcome a couple mirror matches, and there's the interesting inclusion of Avery in this 60. Magnus Pedersen has brought back the Glasses build of Lost Zone box, which we saw do well at the Stuttgart Regional Championships a few months back, with just a few tweaks from Christian's original 60. The Mew EX has come into the deck list as well as a Bravery Charm, which I think is a really interesting, possibly greedy tech inclusion, but as we've seen with things like Iron Hands, that hit point buff can be a really big deal. And rounding out the top 8 is just another Giratina with Gavin Irving. The reason why I wanted to mention this deck list in general is that this is my idea of the perfect stock 60, actually. There's basically no fluff in terms of tech inclusions, and Gavin has made the space for 5 switching outs and the 2 poker gear, so you're at least giving yourself a chance in terms of consistency. Outside of that, the other sort of main stories of Liverpool was that Roaring Moon once again got a really high placement at 9th. These are all Cawthorn 60s, and it had a number of great day 2 placements. Jake Malander was able to get a top 16 placement with Chien-Pao Baxcalibur, which is again the Jared Grimes build that we've seen recently. Tords found his way back to Gardevoir and had a nice top 16 placement. Playing a build with no fluffy supporters, just Iono and Research, as well as 1 copy of Boss. There was a build of Giratina that made top 32 with 0 Water Energy in the 60, and definitely most interesting among the top 32 was 2 pilots of this Arceus Rayquaza VMAX build. It looks like between the 2 players, their losses came to Gardevoirs and Charizard EXs, which doesn't give me too much encouragement, but their overall records were really strong. At the end of the day, Rayquaza VMAX is a pretty chunky dude with big one-hit KO potential. Delphox V can provide some snipe pressure, and that Heatran over a number of turns will become a real threat. This one is certainly a head-scratcher, but with such great conversion from so few people piloting the deck, you have to give it some credit, and I might have to give it some testing. That's it then for the high-performing decks at the Liverpool Regional Championships. I did just want to quickly touch on my day, and yes, I said day, not weekend, and that's because I had a pretty torrid time. I chose to play a Lost Zone Charizard EX archetype. It's a pretty greedy deck, and I knew that going into the tournament, but I thought its matchups were absolutely insane and would carry me. However, I had a pretty rough time of things. I got donked 5 times during the day, which is pretty poor. My matchups were actually pretty good. The only bad matchup was round 1. I faced Christian Fontenot playing Sablezard, which is one of the tougher matchups, and we know he's a really solid player, already has won a major this season. I had a number of situations where prizing really hurt me. I kept prizing Manaphy against Greninja-based decks. I prized my Cramorant against Fontenot in game 3, where I could really easily have pressurized him. So overall did have quite an unfortunate day, but overall I don't think this archetype is going to be a keeper. Wanted to throw the list out there because I do think it's a cool one and it's fun to play around with, but I don't think it's going to be a high tier tier threat in this format. And I did just want to point to the fact that I was playing much more outs than some of these other Lost Zone decks that have done really well in the tournament towards hitting those Chorus, and even just having extra ball search cards in the deck list. So yeah, bit of a grim day for me, unfortunately, but thanks to everyone who said hello at the Liverpool Regionals. I am going to Dortmund, I'm going to be playing as well, so I'm not going to be piloting this deck. I'm going to have to pick up a new archetype in the next couple of weeks and see how it goes. Not sure just what that deck is going to be, but I'll let you know in the next couple of weeks as we prepare for that tournament. Before Dortmund, of course, we do have the Knoxville Regional Championships coming up this week, so also going to keep my eye on that. Let me know your thoughts down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.